Welcome everyone to Catalista's The Beautiful Work Challenge on Birth Conversation. My name is Fiona Callum, coming to you from the studios at Catalista Centrale. Here at Catalista, we like to look at the big issues facing humanity, and none is bigger than birth. On today's episode, we'll consider the connection between how we were born and who we are today. We'll take on a cosmic vision of birth, and we'll delve into birth and its relation to our current planetary polycrisis. The conversation starts now with two extraordinary guests. Becca Tarnas is an assistant professor in philosophy, cosmology, and consciousness at the California Institute of Integral Studies in San Francisco. Her doctoral dissertation was titled The Back of Beyond, the Red Books of C.G. Jung and J.R.R. Tolkien. Becca is an editor of Archetype, the Journal of Archetypal Cosmology, and author of Journey to the Imaginal Realm, a reader's guide to J.R.R. Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings. Becca is currently researching and writing a biography of Stanislav Grof, who was a co-founder of transpersonal psychology. Sean Kelly is a professor in the Philosophy, Cosmology and Consciousness program at the California Institute of Integral Studies. He received his PhD in Religious Studies from the University of Ottawa. Sean is the author of Becoming Gaia, On the Threshold of Planetary Initiation, Coming Home, The Birth and Transformation of the Planetary Era, and he co-edited Psyche Unbound, Essays in Honour of Stanislav Grof with Richard Tarnas. Sean's current research includes the evolution of consciousness, integral ecologies, and transpersonal and integral theory. Welcome, Becca and Sean. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Becca and Sean, can we start off with an introduction of transpersonal psychology, the work of Stanislav Grof, and one specific birth-related aspect of Grof's work, the perinatal matrices?
John, why don't you start us off?
Okay.
I'll come in since you've been working in this field longer than I have.
Well, one fascinating thing about transpersonal psychology that most people, including most psychologists, don't know is that standard psychology, or let's just say psychology as a field, was actually transpersonal in its origins. If we go back to the first recognized experimental psychologist, one of the two at least, Gustav Fechner, in the middle of the 19th century, most of his writings, or at least a full half of his writings, had to do with things like the inner life of plants, the anatomy of angels, life after death, basically the nature of the soul, or what we might call the spiritual dimension of the psyche. And then if we go to the United States with William James, who taught the first course in psychology in the United States, and he said that was the first one that he took as well, was the one that he taught. William James, of course, is remembered for his classic, The Varieties of Religious Experience, and for his great interest in psychical research, or what we might call parapsychology these days, and Jung, of course. So these three great founders of modern psychology, Fechner, James, and Jung, were transpersonal to begin with. But in the early 20th and the middle of the 20th century, two other main so-called forces of psychology, to use Abraham Maslow's terms, became dominant. First of all, Freudian psychoanalysis, which has a more or less antagonistic and reductionistic attitude towards religion, spirituality, we could say the transpersonal, and then behaviorism, which of course is a form of psychology that even denies the psyche, that focuses strictly on the external, quantitative, measurable aspects of behavior. So the dominant field of psychology, in a sense, became amnesiac relative to its own origins. But then interesting things started to happen. Do you want to maybe take over from here, Becca?
Sure. So just kind of picking up with that thread, were you leading towards the Stan Grof line? in terms of the interesting things that started to happen. Well, one very interesting ingredient that entered into the field was the synthesization of LSD 25, and first synthesized by Albert Hofmann in 1938 and then tested in 1943 with his famous bicycle day. And this was really at the beginning of the golden age of psychopharmacological research, and looking for substances that could help explain and cure different psychoses. Schizophrenia was really the big question of what causes schizophrenia. Can it be cured by chemical means? And LSD seemed like it was a very promising substance because the early researchers into LSD thought that it created what they called, it was a psychotomimetic. It was creating a reversible psychosis. So psychiatrists, psychologists could experience what it might be like to be psychotic. But in the mid-1950s, the Czech psychiatrist Stanislav Grof, he had his initiatory experience with LSD, which was completely life-changing. And he started off by exploring it in the psychopharmacological lens as well, but then came to recognize that this was more like a non-specific amplifier of psyche, and that one could understand the layers of the unconscious through what this medium revealed. And so he was doing research in Prague, the late 1950s through much of the 1960s. Eventually, he came to the United States, to Baltimore, and continued his research there. And what he was finding in his research with patients, first, in the LSD sessions, patients would regress through layers of their lived experience, their biography, their personal unconscious. And as they regressed further and further through early childhood, infancy, they started to have these experiences that many of them related to feeling like they were dying. And he described that it was quite terrifying in the beginning, actually, because the patients would say that, this isn't a session anymore. Call the ambulance. I'm really dying. But he would check their vitals, and physically they were okay, but they felt like they were dying. And he came to recognize that this was more like a psychological death that was taking place for them. But alongside that feeling of dying was another set of experiences that, from the medical training that Stan Grof had been educated within, should be completely impossible. And this was that the patients were reporting that they were reliving their births. And this at the time was seen, we don't have a way of storing the memory of our birth. Infants were seen as to not feel pain or have experience. And so how could this be remembered? And yet patient after patient was reporting these extraordinarily detailed and verifiable experiences of their own births. And so not only did this affirm for Grof that the experience of birth is indeed something we can remember, that it leaves a deep imprint in the psyche, but that it then goes on to be a kind of pattern that shapes our later psychology. And he identified 4 functional structures of the psyche that he called the basic perinatal matrices. And the abbreviation for this, just BPM 1, 2, 3, and 4. And these relate to the clinical stages of the birth process. But alongside those clinical stages of the birth process were also all of these additional layers of experience, of images, of emotions that he described as being related through experiential logic. that through the experience of that, you could see how almost symbolically those images, those experiences, those encounters were connected to these four functional structures of the psyche. And so, shall I briefly kind of break down those four? Would that be helpful?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. So the basic perinatal matrices, it begins with BPM1, which is the primal union with the mother. And this is the experience that the baby has within the womb before the birth process, before labor has started. And what Grof found was, alongside just simply the experience of the baby being immersed in the womb, in the amniotic universe, and kind of merged with the mother, that a lot of images would and experiences would accompany this of kind of an oceanic unity, images of whales and jellyfish and of, the Milky Way, the galaxy, stars, very kind of mystical quality. A lot of images of kind of angelic beings or connection with the sacred mother goddess. Again, this kind of sense of primal union, oneness, this oceanic quality would attend the more biological images of the baby, the fetus in the mother's womb. And for those patients who had very positive experiences of their gestation process, where the pregnancy was unfolding in a healthy way, these would just be deeply nourishing, profoundly positive, kind of spiritual experiences. Whereas for those where perhaps the pregnancy wasn't as healthy, maybe the mother was, smoking cigarettes or drinking, or there was a RH incompatibility between the baby and the mother, then that sense of undifferentiated unity would take on a toxic quality. It would feel like this overwhelming sense of anxiety, of danger, of just being permeated by toxins. So for some patients, this could be very positive. For others, it could have a more toxic, negative quality. Some would even have both. Stan Grof reported in his experiences of it going both ways, where these more negative experiences would give way into that positive sense of primal union. That's before the birth process begins. That's before labor starts. And so the second perinatal matrix relates to the first clinical phase of birth. So it's BPM2, but it's the first clinical phase of birth. And this is when the contractions have started. So the womb is contracting, but the cervix has not yet fully dilated. And so the experiences that Grof's patients would report would be a sense of kind of like a paradise lost, and that they had been cut off from that feeling of divine union. And there would instead be a sense of alienation, loss, fear, impending doom, eternal damnation, kind of being, eternally damned to hell, and, no escape, kind of no exit situation, because there's the sense of the kind of punishing pain and restriction and even limitation of oxygen that comes with the contractions, but there's no way out. So it's just this sense of profound shift from what came before into this place of isolation, pain, and punishment. And then we shift into the second clinical phase of birth, which is BPM3, the third basic perinatal matrix. This is when the cervix has fully dilated. And so now begins the baby's journey actually through the birth canal. My midwife called this the longest, shortest journey that we take, because it's such a short distance, but it's such a long experience. And what Grof found in his research with his patients was that the intensified pressures that the baby undergoes of being squeezed through the birth canal would bring up very powerful, intense feelings of almost kind of a cathartic level of pressure and release. And so images of fiery hells and devils and volcanoes erupting and very kind of primal images of wild animals. There's a sexual component as well that he noticed amongst his patients that would be activated in this matrix, a kind of blending of pleasure and pain, of both having pain inflicted on one and inflicting pain on another organism, the kind of pain and pleasure between the mother and child as the child is being born. And so this is the third perinatal matrix, but unlike the second, where there's no exit, where there's this sense of entrapment, the third perinatal matrix is a struggle for survival, a kind of death rebirth experience, because there is literally a light at the end of the tunnel. There is a way out, and that struggle for survival to kind of make one's way through the birth canal. And this also can bring about, direct encounters with biological material, in a very literal sense, urine, feces, amniotic fluid. If the baby is under a lot of stress, their own meconium. And then emergence into a whole new reality. And this brings us to the third clinical stage of birth, and the fourth perinatal matrix, which is when the baby actually emerges from the birth canal and enters into a new world, a new reality, and is ideally reconnected with the mother. And so with this would often come attendant feelings of triumph, of success, of joy, of sudden awakening into a whole new reality, images of reconnecting with the great mother goddess, a kind of dazzling, bright light and beauty. And one image that would come up again and again amongst Grof's patients would be, like the colors of a peacock's tail and rainbows, and that divine white light in that sense of successful emergence. Now, he also found that for babies who were born where there were a lot of drugs administered, that fourth stage would sometimes feel more like waking up from a hangover or getting over a flu, where it was a little bit more kind of foggy, not so glorious of a breakthrough. There's much more that, of course, could be said about all four. I want to ping it back over to Sean to see what threads I might have missed there, and to make that connection. If Sean, that feels all right for you to pick up.
Sure, that's such a magnificent encapsulation of the that part of the story in the perinatal dimension. Wow, I'm so glad that this is being recorded. One thing maybe to highlight how the birth experience represents the first engagement with not only what we could say it's the first experience of the birth of individuality, of differentiation from the mother, right? And so it's the emergence of a separate self-sense, in other words. And that separate self, or relatively separate self, because it's always a self in relation, both during the birth process and obviously after birth, but it is a relatively separate self as compared to the very first stage of pregnancy. That emergence of a separate self is simultaneously or accompanied by a death, an experience of death, a death to the fusion state with the mother, or the death of the fetal identity, you might say, which is relatively non-differentiated. So right from the beginning, the sense of self is wedded to this mystery of death, or life and death, birth and death are paired right from the beginning. That's one thing to underline. And the other thing, which is related to that, is that because of this threshold that the birth experience occupies between life and death, the perinatal domain Grof found seems to act or can act as a kind of portal to the transpersonal. So not only is it the developmental locus of the emergence of the personal or of a relatively separate self-sense, but it's also a gateway or a portal to the transpersonal, to what Grof initially called the Jungian psyche. So, he distinguished between the Freudian unconscious, the Ronchian or the birth unconscious, and then the Jungian unconscious that has to do with the archetypal realm, collective unconscious, and so on. He would later call that the transpersonal unconscious. So the perinatal, or we could say the archetype of birth, is this magical portal between the personal and the transpersonal, between the biological and the spiritual, between the finite and the infinite, and so on. I just wanted to maybe highlight that.
And yes, so what Grof found in working with his patients too was that when the patients regressed back not only through their biographical, their childhood experiences, but went all the way back to reliving their birth experiences. For many of them, this reliving would then create a kind of release of different symptoms that they were dealing with in their lives, different psychopathological symptoms that going through that kind of regression all the way back to birth allowed for this kind of cathartic letting go of patterns that they had been dealing with that weren't really being healed in other forms of therapy or other psychiatric approaches. So there was something about going back to that root experience that had this tremendous healing kind of gift that it offered. And then, as Sean's saying, it's kind of this portal as well to the transpersonal. And so it doesn't stop at birth. That isn't, I called it a root experience, but it goes beyond that in many ways. And people would also recover what seemed like past life memories that would be symbolically patterned, mirroring their birth experience, mirroring experiences they were having later in life as well. That they created these kind of chains, these patterns that Grof called coex systems of condensed experience, that one could recognize as kind of archetypally informed all the way through life, through birth, and into these transpersonal domains. And that all of that seemed to be connected to what individuals were struggling with in terms of their psychology.
Yeah, maybe if I could just add one thing here too. So the flip side of the transpersonal book, just as you were saying, Becca, in terms of pathology, one of the just brilliant, revolutionary insights that Grof's work brought was how to understand the phenomenology, the experiential qualities and the behavioral phenomenological qualities of really intense pathologies like malignant aggression or treatment-resistant depression, very, very deep forms of depression, as well as certain forms of dissociation, psychotic breaks and so on, and sexual perversions. He shows just meticulously and really convincingly how the Freudian approach, for instance, is not adequate to explain, or the usual sociological early childhood account of experiences by themselves are not sufficient to explain the intensity of some of these pathologies. Whereas once we enter into the full complexity and depth of the birth experience in the way that Becca so beautifully described, it starts to make sense how fixation at one or other of these phases of the birth experience can become a kind of template for ongoing suffering and acting out at an unconscious level on the part of the adult.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but didn't Grof move from the use of LSD to breath work in his therapeutic work? Could you talk a bit about that?
Sure. Yeah, so Grof was working primarily with LSD and some other substances, beginning in Prague in the 1950s and 60s. He moved to the United States in 1967, continued that work with LSD psychotherapy in Baltimore until 1973. And in the 70s, this is when a lot of the legitimate research into psychedelic psychotherapy was being shut down all across the United States and in many parts of the world. And so with making LSD an illegal substance, Grof turned to another methodology. First, he was scholar in residence at Esalen Institute in Big Sur, and he was teaching workshops there. He was writing his books. And in teaching these workshops, he was telling workshop participants about these experiences that people would have with LSD. And they said, well, this is all very wonderful to hear about it, but we want to have some kind of an experience. And so he and his late wife, Christina Grof, developed in the mid-1970s something that they called holotropic breathwork. And the word holotropic is a neologism that Grof coined that means moving towards wholeness. And the breathwork is a surprisingly simple modality of very deep breathing combined with powerful music and a particular form of body work that seeks to intensify any physical sensations that are coming up so that they can be released. And the amazing thing is that with this modality, and of course there's forms of breath work from traditions all around the world that can expand one's consciousness. But what was extraordinary was with this method of holotropic breath work, they were able to see people going through the same kinds of experiences that they did in the LSD psychotherapy. So without the drug catalyst, but rather simply the power of the breath and the music and being in the right container of facilitation, people could access these levels of the unconscious as well, including reliving their birth experiences, and find the same kind of healing through that modality.
Sean, you mentioned Carl Jung a few times, and Becca, you've written extensively about him. We'd love to hear you talk about Jung's rebirth archetype and what is meant by the imaginal.
Jung noticed quite early on, one of the occasions for the break with Freud, Jung's first major book, big book, Symbols of Transformation, as it's called in English, but Symbols and Transformation of the Libido would be a direct translation of the German, in which Jung took the fantasies of an American woman and amplified them by showing all kinds of correlations with the world's mythology, going from India to all of the material that was available at the time, from anthropological research, from indigenous mythology, indigenous stories, rites, and so on. And one of the main themes that he focused on was the theme of, he would later call it, I don't think he called it in that book actually, the death rebirth archetype, but he noticed that images surrounding birth, death, and the transformation that birth and death signal. So the basic idea would be transformation, the emergence and ongoing transformation of the sense of self or identity. That this was a universal motif that could be found across all cultures at all times. And he would formulate this later, in particular, as not only the birth of the separate self sense, or what he called the ego, the differentiation of the ego out of the unconscious, but an even deeper transformation that is celebrated and elaborated in the various religious traditions, religious spiritual traditions, expressed mythologically as well, that we could describe as the birth of the true self, or the shift from a merely separate self sense of the ego to a sense of self that is in ongoing living communication with the deeper structures of life in the cosmos, the deeper levels of the psyche that he called the collective unconscious or the archetypal realm. And so that process he would call individuation, which is not only the process of the becoming an individual separate self-sense, but is the potential that we all have to become a whole being. And to become a whole being for Jung meant, yes, having a differentiated ego so that we could be free, potentially free beings and free agents, but also to have a conscious relationship to the great mystery of life itself, for which there are many names, the divine, the Godhead, the Great Mother. As a psychologist, he chose to call it the collective unconscious or the archetypal realm, which he also called, however, at one point, the matrix mind. And matrix here is, of course, the same root as mother. So he recognized that the collective unconscious is the mother mind out of which, or the mother psyche at large, the cosmic womb, as it were, not only out of which we emerge, but in which we always have our being. So the great wisdom traditions, Jung recognized, at one point or another, all concern themselves with working out an ongoing conscious relationship to this mystery, this matrix mind. And that is the true goal of at least a conscious individuation, this path of wholeness, which we could also describe as the cultivation of the true self, capital S, which is greater than and includes the ego or the small self ego. Right. So, yeah, maybe that's good enough for now. Maybe you have something to add, Becca.
Well, I'll just pick up the second part of that question around the imaginal, because following on the heels of Jung's publication of Transformations and Symbols of the Libido, which came out in 1911 and 1912, he began to undergo what he called his confrontation with the unconscious, which he recorded over the next several years in a book that has become known as the Red Book, but he named it Liber Novus, which means the new book. And in the Red Book, he records these experiences that began emerging for him at first spontaneously, but then through a practice that he came to call active imagination. And so at first it was these kind of spontaneous visionary experiences. The first one came to him while he was on a train journey where he saw Europe flooded with blood. And 9 months later, he would come to realize that this was a kind of premonition of the outbreak of World War I, the Great War. And but he didn't know that there was this reflection in the outer world at this point of what he was experiencing. He thought it was entirely interior to his own psyche. And so in wanting to understand what was emerging for him, was it a latent psychosis? What was happening? He really began to delve into a dialogue with his psyche. And so he began to evoke these very immersive, what he called fantasies, through this practice of active imagination. And he would enter into these dialogues that then would kind of take on the form of a fully immersive visionary experience. And he wrote these down in first his journals that are called the Black Books, which have been published just as of 4 years ago. And then he transcribed those experiences and gave them a commentary, put them in the Red Book. He illustrated them. And this, you could say, this place where these fantasies unfold, one could refer to as the imaginal or the imaginal realm. And there's a number of different scholars who've written and spoken about this kind of middle realm, this place where the archetypes of the collective unconscious emerge in engagement with us. And we can enter into dialogue with them. We can kind of be in a place that is no place. And the interesting thing about this idea of the imaginal, I really appreciate the scholar Henri Corbin and how he describes the imaginal as making a differentiation between what he calls the imaginary, or that which is just simply made up. We all know when we're making something up, we're kind of just pulling it out cognitively, versus something else. And he's getting at it with this term imaginal, where images and internal experiences, and they emerge within us, but we're not controlling it. We're not making it up. We are experiencing something, we're perceiving something, and there's a reality to it. But it's different than the reality that's outside of us, that has a grounding in the physical world. But it's an inner world. And as Jung writes in the Red Book, the inner world is as vast as the outer world. It's as infinite as the outer world, recognizing that we live in two worlds, and that this inner world is archetypally informed. It's where the archetypes of the collective unconscious become conscious in a way, and we can enter into direct relationship with them. And what seems to be clear in the Red Book, in which the archetypal psychologist James Hillman kind of carries further in his writings, is that it's not just internal to our own individual psyche, that inner world opens out into, well, it is the collective unconscious. It opens out into something that is shared amongst us. And so it's not just subjective, and it's not just objective either. It's kind of something that's in between. It's participatory, and that this emerges in what we might call the imaginal realm. So Jung's Red Book, I think, is a beautiful documentation of that realm, and the fact that we can have experiences of that, we can access that. And there's many different modalities for such access. For Jung, it was active imagination. For Grof, it's whether it's LSD or holotropic breathwork. And, we can name many other practices that can kind of open that doorway to us.
And dream work, of course. Yeah.
And dream work. Yes, definitely.
Yeah.
Are there any specific indicators to differentiate between what is the imagination and the imaginal? How do you define which one you're actually in?
It's a really good question. And I actually want to know how Sean would answer that first.
Well, I think you already did it in a way. I mean, I think you did, but not as a response to that question. But in saying that, in recognizing that occasionally we don't create, if what we're experiencing has the quality of autonomy. So, for instance, I could say, well, I'm going to think about a unicorn. So I'm imagining a unicorn, or I'm going to imagine a new apartment that I'm going to enter into. Well, okay, it's there, and I'm imagining it. But if I then stick with the new apartment and just observe it, and at a certain point, something starts to happen. Well, this being is. Somebody is walking into the apartment, and I don't know who it is. And if I allow that to happen, and it takes on a kind of quality of its own, a narrative quality, an autonomy, where the images, but it's not just a visual image, it's the whole sense of meaning. It could have auditory qualities, it could have all kinds of qualities, but it's primarily imagistic and often primarily visual. If the experience starts to take on a quality of agency that is relatively independent of our own intention, of our own conscious intention, that's one quality. And this refers to the part of what is meant by the objective psyche that Becca was just referring to. And then the other dimension, of course, is strictly the archetypal. So if the figures or the themes or the images in question, upon reflection, at least afterwards, if we note that the images or the what has been experienced shares deep structural qualities with certain universal motifs, such as the figure of the hero, or birth, or death, transformation, or more abstract qualities like circularity, containment, the cross, tension of opposites, universal themes such as those. Then we know as well that that the archetypal dimension is at play. Of course, the archetypal dimension is always at play, but in these types of experiences, once they start to inform what is going on, then that's another dimension of objectivity, as it were, that is an indication that we might be dealing with the imaginal rather than the merely imaginary.
Thank you so much for explaining that. Sean, you've written about our current planetary polycrisis. How does that relate to what we've been discussing?
Well, on so many levels, but to begin with, perhaps the overarching overlap or resonance, we could say, has to do with the fact that the Earth community as a whole is being drawn into what I've described and others have described as a collective near-death experience. Of course, certain communities are living that all the time, and war-torn communities, disaster communities that are dealing with disaster, and we all deal with this level in one form or another in our individual lives. But as a species, and indeed as an Earth community, the Earth community as a whole, so the human and the other than human, are at a point now. Well, let's just speak about the other than human. We're in an accelerating phase of the sixth mass extinction of species, which means that the vast majority of species on the planet are on the brink of disappearing. At least those species of complex life. There are almost no wild animals left in terms of biomass. Wild animals make up less than, I think, 4% of animal mass on the planet. It's 90-some% humans, cows, pigs, and chickens, right? But if we just take the communities and the ecosystems upon which these communities depend, they're experiencing on a planetary scale what some people call the great unraveling. So the very web of life is starting to unravel in our own time. And mass extinction is how that is often described. The last time that happened was 66 million years ago. So many, many millions of years before even the emergence of the first hominins, let alone our own species 300,000 years ago. So we now are the first humans and some of the first mammals actually ever to experience a mass extinction of species. That's happening in our own time. So the reality of a collective death on a planetary scale is something that we're all, consciously or not, and mostly unconsciously, feeling or starting to feel. Okay? So right away, we're drawn to this archetypal realm, this central mystery, this central archetype, really, of death rebirth that lies at the origin of each of us individually, in terms of our own birth, lies at the origin of our species, lies at the origin of complex life. That's perhaps the main feature to keep in mind.
I wondered if we could delve a little deeper into some more of your work. In your book, Becoming Gaia, you propose that we need to go beyond hope and despair in our current moment that you describe as end times. Can you talk a bit about hope, despair, and end times?
Maybe I could relate this a little bit to our discussion of the perinatal matrices. But first, I'll just say that I'm sure you're all aware of more and more people experiencing despair, feelings of despair, obviously anxiety, depression. We could characterize that as despair, sense of hopelessness, frustration. And in response to this, many people the past few years, have been trying to rework the idea of hope. The obvious question is, in face of mass extinction, ecological devastation, civilizational collapse, and so on, how can we face the future? We need hope. The traditional forms of hope have failed many, which has led people to propose things like radical hope or active hope as alternatives to traditional views of hope. If the traditional view of hope, let's say, of the American dream was hope in continuing technological progress, continuing improvement in standards of living, better salaries, longer lifespans, opportunity for all, and so on. We could even relate that just to the great dream of the modern period of continuous progress, whether it's of the liberal democratic variety or of the communist variety. That hope that defined the modern period has more or less died. And other forms of hope have emerged to replace that form of hope. Of course, there's always the traditional religious forms of hope, if you're a Christian, for instance, but that is hope in an afterlife, hope in another world that follows this life. And for many people, that kind of hope is still in play and is still sufficient. But for those who do not have a traditional hope in an afterlife on the one hand, or who can no longer believe in the modernist ideal of progress as a form of hope, then what other forms of hope are there? So people have proposed radical hope, let's say, or active hope. Our dear friend and mentor, Joanna Macy, and her friend and co-author, Chris Johnstone, wrote a book called Active Hope, where hope is now no longer defined in terms of an expectation of some kind of rosy future, but is rather the expression of an action, an affirmation of the will in the direction of what we believe to be good and desirable. So the hope. So personally, I'm fine with that view of active hope, although I prefer not to call it hope, because I think so many people will find it even that hard to adopt. Hope is ringing hollow for a lot of people. So I've personally been trying to find a way between this binary of despair and hope. And but functionally, it's pretty much the same as what Joanna Macy and Chris Johnstone are calling active hope, and that is, namely, a position of the heart-mind that is informed by our intuitive sense of what we know to be good and true and beautiful. And from that intuitive knowing, an unconditional affirmation to live for that, regardless of what seems to be a likely outcome. And I've described that as a form of faith rather than hope.
Does active hope have an aspirational quality to it?
Yes, it does. It certainly does. We can aspire to a better world. Well, one thing is certain, that however things will turn out, it's always possible to choose a path that will involve less suffering and that will increase. You could say that there's a path of less suffering and also a path of greater love, right, on the one hand. And that choice is always there. We know that we can choose love over hate. We can choose the path that does not amplify aggression and suffering, that affirms life. And so that's a choice that's always available to us. And we don't know what that will lead to in terms of any ultimate outcome, but it's a choice that is intrinsically good immediately. I'll just say this as well, that this kind of path that I'm exploring, in the 60s, where existentialism was quite popular, there's a similar attitude that we do things because we choose to do them because they're good, whether it's heroic or. Personally, for me, that's not enough. I need some kind of experiential relationship to what we've been talking about, the transpersonal, the great mystery, some form of spiritual life, and that can take many forms. But with that kind of relationship, and Yeah, with that kind of relationship, it becomes a lot easier and even joyful, potentially joyful, to take a path that does not include any kind of likely expectation of a favorable outcome as we would normally conceive of it, but is nevertheless held and grounded in something that is intrinsically and infinitely good and true and beautiful.
Thank you, Sean. That brings me beautifully onto what I would love to discuss now with Becca. Becca, congratulations. You have recently gone through the incredible journey of birth and motherhood, and I would love to hear how you respond to Sean's vision of the end times as a new mother.
It's certainly something that has been very deeply involved in my thinking and feeling entering into motherhood. And, the birth of my child was a very intentional and planned birth. And long before I came to the California Institute of Integral Studies and engaged in the work that Sean and I do in philosophy, cosmology, and consciousness, I was an environmental studies major in undergrad. And so I've been thinking about these ideas for a very long time and have often been asked the question of, why do you want to bring a child into the world, considering the state that we're in terms of an ecological crisis and so forth? And is it even a responsible thing to do, and adding to the population and so forth? And so these are all things that my husband and I thought very deeply about before having a family. And one thing that we both came to recognize a few years ago after his mother passed away was that we feel aligned with what my husband calls team life. And Sean was illustrating this as well in what he was speaking to, of taking action towards life-giving and life-enhancing ways of moving through the world. And so what I find is that if we are in the end times, if the world truly is ending, it takes a long time. Even when in certain moments and in certain communities, it can feel like it's happening very quickly. It also is happening as a multi-generational experience. And I want to be able to raise children who go into the world as it is with clear, open eyes, knowing what they're facing and not being in denial about that, and having a love for that world as it is. I think that part of our role in this time, and this also comes out of the work of Joanna Macy, who Sean brought up, but I've had my own very deep experiences of it, of feeling as though we are both hospice workers and midwives at the same time for this moment of the human species and the earth community, and ultimately the cosmic community, kind of looking beyond our individual identities into these kind of larger nested identities. And so for me, it felt very important to raise a child, to raise a family in that context, to love the natural world as it is, and to be able to feel the feelings of grief for the species that are being lost. I feel very aware of that, oddly enough, when you see children's toys or Halloween costumes of species that are disappearing, the butterflies and the polar bears and the frogs and the owls, and even the tiny species that so often slip our notice, and the plants and so on, that they're still celebrated in children's books and in their costumes, clothes, toys. But to be aware that those actual species are disappearing, and wanting to be able to contribute something to the world by teaching the next generation to know exactly what is unfolding in this time, and that my children will hopefully be able to pass that on to their children. And it's kind of like holding a candle in the darkness. holding that light through the dark night, that I think is a form of active hope. And that life is still worth living and celebrating, not in spite, but because of the losses that we're going through right now. And I think kind of tying together a lot of the themes that we've been discussing, this very intimate connection between birth and death that we go through when we are born, that we go through when we give birth, that we go through when we have a psycho-spiritual experience of death and rebirth, and that is happening on this planetary scale, that we ultimately don't know the outcome. And I think there's multiple outcomes. There isn't just one story unfolding. There are many deaths unfolding in this moment, and there are many births unfolding. And I think that overall will continue. And when we take a really large scale beyond, my little family or our community or the human species, and we look at these cycles of mass extinctions, the fact that life has come back more complex and more beautiful after each mass extinction, even if it's millennia later, we are part of something and participating in something that is so much larger than we are, both at an evolutionary scale and maybe at a soul level as well. Sean was speaking about that spiritual perspective, that an experience that we can hold, that kind of gives us that candle in the dark through these experiences. And through my own experiences and study and research, the idea that we may reincarnate, that we don't just live this one lifetime, is another reason to keep going. So those are some of the ideas and thoughts and feelings that have been emerging for me long before I had a child, and have become very real and in a new way since having a child.
Did childbirth affect your understanding of the 4 birth matrices? Was that something you thought about during your pregnancy and birth?
Yes, it was. Having the great privilege to study Stan Grof's work, and so many of these other thinkers around birth and psychology and so forth, this very much went into my thinking and preparation for pregnancy and for labor. And along the way, in terms of my labor experience and my decision making for the kind of labor I wanted to have, it was all very deeply informed by that. So I gave birth at home. I had a water birth. So my son was born into a tub in our bedroom, and I had an amazing midwife and birthing team, and who were all very affirmative of creating an experience where I had freedom of movement, of expression, the ability to drink water and eat food, and not be medicated and so forth, and always having the possibility of, if we needed emergency medical help, it could be there. And we were blessed that we didn't need that. But yes, the basic perinatal matrices were there in my mind through the whole thing. And, that the first basic perinatal matrix, of course, which encompasses the gestation period, any question that the baby isn't conscious and aware and interacting with you, I mean, that just completely was affirmed that there is a being who is very present and having an experience and participating through the gestation, through birth. It was very, very clear. And my water actually didn't break through most of my labor. I had a 26-hour labor at home. And so that second basic perinatal matrix was quite long. But for both of us, I think it was kind of cushioned because the water didn't break. And so I think it'll be amazing to ask my son these questions in however many years till he can give answers to it. Might be sooner than we expect. Who knows? I think that second perinatal matrix for me, certainly, and for him, might be less challenging than was often reported by many of Grof's patients. And I remember my midwife, whenever she would take my son's heartbeat throughout the labor, she would say, "He loves being in labor." I've never heard that before. He loves being in labor. And I think probably the most challenging part for both of us was the third perinatal matrix, where he's actually was moving through the birth canal. It took me some time to actually, get his head out. And I imagine from his experience that would feel immensely prolonged. So again, I'll be very curious to hear those answers from him on what his experience was like. But I got to deliver my son with my own hands, and my husband caught him in the water and put him right on my chest. So I have a feeling that his fourth perinatal matrix is probably pretty positive, and he stayed connected to the umbilical cord for a good amount of time, so that all the blood that's in the placenta could beat back into his little body. So he had all his blood, and yeah. But that's my side of the experience, and it's going to be a beautiful learning experience when I can finally ask my son what that was like for him.
Thank you so much for sharing that very, very personal and insightful perspective. Very much appreciated. And are there any loose ends on any of the areas and topics that we've talked about that either of you would like to bring up?
So especially since we were speaking of Jung and our relationship with Jung, how he figures into all of this earlier. Jung was one of the things that he really helped me and many others see is that our time, that we're living in a transitional time that he described in terms of a changing of the gods. And he used the ancient Greek, two ancient Greek terms, one kairos, which is one of the words for time. There are different words for time. Chronos, what's the other one? Chronos, kairos, and ion. That's right. Ion. So the other word was ion. So kairos, though, first of all, was the opportune moment. It's a qualitative description of a moment in time that is ripe for radical transformation, radical renewal of one kind or another. That's the kairos. And our own particular time, our collective time, which was Jung's time, particularly in the 1950s and 60s, but it's still our time, and perhaps even more so now, is a time of a changing of the ages. And he was informed in his understanding of this changing of the ages by astrology. We've all heard of the dawning of the age of Aquarius. This is a shift of a synchronistic shift of the spring point. So what constellations are behind the sun at dawn on the first day of spring? Those constellations shift very, very slowly. They make a complete cycle in roughly 26,000 years. And as that point shifts, it's called the precession of the equinoxes. It takes about 2,000 years to pass through one sign. So we are now on the border between two different signs: Pisces, which characterized the previous 2,000 years, and Aquarius, which is the new astrological age that we're entering into now. So each of these ages, the Greek word is an ion. So we're entering a new ion or aeon, and it's a moment of kairos, or it's ripe for radical transformation, for a changing of the gods. This is a very exciting time to be in. So not only, it happens every 2,000 years, but as we know, this particular shift of the ages is unlike any other that humans have experienced. So it's scary, and it's a blessing for those of us who have at least the privilege to contemplate our moment in this way, where we're not, for those of us who are not struggling for survival. So we can, by taking in the unique and archetypal quality of this moment. It's both unique and archetypal at the same time. Those of us who can do that can draw from that enormous psychospiritual resources, which hopefully will not only serve to enrich our own personal lives and our immediate communities, but could in some way contribute to the best possible outcome for this transition that we're all involved in. And we each have we're each uniquely positioned given our individual gifts, our natures, our personalities, our histories, the communities that we're placed in. We're each uniquely situated to do something that only we can do. And so the great gift of our time is one where we can yoke our individual gifts and our sacred individuality that Jung called the self to this great challenge and opportunity of our times, of the shifting of the ages. So this is it's an invitation, it's a call that those of us who are lucky enough to be able to access these forms of consciousness, it's a call to enter into that great adventure, the great turning, as Joanna called it.
Are we in the third stage of the birth process, moving towards hope and aspiration?
My feeling is we're still in BPM 2. What do you think, Sean?
Well, I think
late BPM 2.
Yeah, I mean, if the Earth community as a whole is, in a sense, being drawn toward a near-death experience, that would suggest BPM 3, 2 or 3. So BPM 2 is the life and death. No, sorry, it's no exit. BPM 3 is the life and death struggle. BPM 4 is the death rebirth experience. So from that perspective, it depends. Some of us, and some communities feel they're firmly in BPM 2. Others are in BPM 3. So where you see people struggling actively, whether to get out of a hellish situation or actively confronting what they consider to be evil or obstacles, that would be more BPM 3. Those who feel trapped in situations of oppression with seemingly no exit. I could name several situations that I'm sure we're all aware of right now, would be more BPM 2. Those of us, even myself, in moments, but when we're engaged in moments of escape or of not only escape, but let's say playful exploration of alternatives, that's more BPM 1. Those who are engaged in fantasies of escape, particularly technologically assisted fantasies of escape, like terraforming Mars or transhumanistic augmentation of the body to achieve some kind of eternal life, fighting death and uploading their minds to the cloud, that's BPM 4. But it's BPM 4 that is, in my opinion, that is actually a kind of fantasy compensation that is avoiding the struggle of BPM 3, or is in denial about BPM 2 and 3 and is sort of rushing to the archetypal potentials of BPM 4 as a fantasy of escape, or is regressing to BPM 1 through, let's say, addictions and various forms of passive fusion, giving up of agency so that one can get away from the pain of the struggle of the death rebirth struggle. So all four matrices are in play right now at different moments in different communities, depending upon what's going on. But the Earth community as a whole seems to be poised somewhere in 2 and 3, I think.
Becca, did you have any final thoughts that you wanted to touch on just to wrap things up?
It does kind of feel like we're at that precipice between BPM 2 and BPM 3 as an Earth community, and that we're certainly not near the end of BPM 3. And I think that the one thing I would add, which is something that I often hear my dad, Rick Tarnas, say, is that with a near-death experience, there's no such thing as a pretend near-death experience. And so you have to really go into the experience understanding that the outcome is uncertain. And so And that's the case with the birth process too, that the outcome certainly can be uncertain, that you can enter into BPM 2 and there may not be a BPM 4, or you enter into BPM 3 and there may not be a BPM 4. And I think that's part of the gravity of this moment too, is recognizing that we don't know the outcome. Something that Joanna Macy, we keep bringing up, I've heard her say multiple times, is don't trust anyone who says they know what's going to happen. Whether that's a hopeful kind of techno-optimist, well, we're going to do this and it's all going to work out, or the other side of we're absolutely doomed and this is the end of all life on Earth. We don't know what's going to happen, and it's in that great mystery that we find ourselves. And so the near-death experience, to be a true near-death experience, has to be an encounter with an actual death experience. And being able to prepare ourselves for that at every level, at that personal level, that psychospiritual level, and the collective level, I think is some of the great work of our time, to know how to face our own demise as a species, as an Earth community, and as individuals, because we're definitely going to go through that as individuals. So it's worth doing that work to prepare ourselves for it.
Thank you. I want to thank both of you for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Fiona, for hosting us and holding this conversation. And Sean, it's always a pleasure to be in dialogue with you and learn from you. So thank you.
Likewise. Yes, thank you so much, Fiona and Becca.
Thank you for joining us for this, the Beautiful Work Challenge on Breath conversation. And thanks to our guests, Becca Tarnas and Sean Kelly. You can find the current schedule of Catalista podcasts, including the Beautiful Work Challenge, and sign up for our weekly email at catalista.net. If you enjoy the show, please like, comment, and add us on your favourite podcast platform. We really appreciate everyone who subscribes to Catalista on Patreon, where contributors can access merch and bonus interviews. The Beautiful Work Challenge on Breath conversation was edited and mixed by Joshua Cash. Our music is composed by George Jennings. The executive producers are Chicky Munch and Binny Bunny Munch, with assistance from Ed Goldberg and Gerald Gerbil. This is Fiona Callan, signing off from the studios at Catalista Centrale. See you next time.